Yes. Well, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are, or depending on what moment you're listening. Welcome at this class on algorithmic decision making. And a special welcome to my friends from Indonesia who joined also in this class. And that's the charm, of course, of online teaching, that everywhere around the world people can just jump into the classroom and I'm now curious whether this is my newest slides, because I made some changes based on what Tina suggested me to do, but I think it was later than this is a very smooth start again. Sorry about that. Let's check. Okay, maybe there's some mistakes. This should be the one. I'm not sure. Oh, you can see it anyway. Whatever. Okay. Share screen. Share. So here we are. I've been instructed that we shouldn't be too dramatic about things going that smooth online, because it's all new for us. And although this is already my, I think, 6th lecture or something. And today, as said, I will discuss the topic of algorithmic decision making. And first, if after about 2 hours from now you think, well, I want to hear more about it, that's possible, because we have these nice videos from the conference on privacy and data protection. That is actually, if you are interested in data protection and privacy, a very interesting YouTube channel, CPDP conferences, because they record basically all sessions from each conference. So there's a wide variety of topics you can watch panels about, discussing interesting issues. And these are 2 examples of panels I did in the past. One was last January on regulatory requirements for algorithms used for governmental decisions, and one 4 years ago, obscured by algorithms, how to prove yes if computer says no. And that last part is basically one of the focus points of this lecture also. That has to do with explanation, and is one of the reasons why we might want to regulate those algorithms, in particular when they decide things about us. Then we don't necessarily want to rely on whatever they're doing, and I will give several examples of when it doesn't work that well. I'm now going to do an experiment that I've never done before, and that's showing you the beginning of the video from January, because I start with an anecdote that's also interesting for this class, but the prime reason I'm showing this 2 minutes of video is to check whether I can manage to do that in Zoom. So I start it now, and you won't see it right away, but only if I share my screen. So it will take some time. Okay. And if it's all going well, then you can also, you can also hear the sound. I will now start sharing my screen of oh, I lost my whole Zoom thing. Meeting controls. Am I still in the meeting? It says now join the meeting, but it's end meeting for all. Better not. Sorry, this is very strange what's happening now. Oh my. Talking. I see that I'm. Help. Help.
We can hear you and we can see you perfectly.
Yeah, but I can't see anything anymore. So I'm not sure. Probably they're listening in and don't want me to share this video or something from Zoom. Oh my. Because you of course can't see the video.
Never mind. Skip the video.
Yeah, we can try later or.
Yeah, but the problem is that I now totally lost my Zoom app.
Yeah, but we can hear you and see you.
Yeah,
so
but I can't see if you can see my slides, for instance.
But we can see your slides, and we
Yes.
will let you know if we can't see your slides.
Okay, then I will call this experiment a failure, and after the break I will try again.
Okay,
yeah,
that's good.
So the anecdote I was referring to was about a lecture in '99 at the International Conference of Artificial Intelligence Law in Oslo by Peter Johnson, someone who ran a business and maybe still does on automated decision making. And it was very one of the best presentations I ever saw. And a very interesting part was these systems were about giving people, deciding whether people were entitled to get an employment benefit or not, or get some social support from the state. And what happened, but what the people using the systems were doing, if they didn't like the outcome of the computer, they just tweaked the input. So imagine that there is this very nice young lady that is in need of social support according to the civil servant, but the system says, the computer says no. Then what the people did was just tweak the input a bit, and then the outcome became what they wanted it to be. And that is basically something that with the new algorithms that we will go into later in this lecture becomes more and more difficult to tweak the system, and that is maybe a good thing. But on the other hand, it also explains that it's sometimes not very clear what the systems are doing, and that's not such a good thing. So if you don't have control over what's happening within the system, so that's one of the points this lecture also focuses on, this intransparency of algorithms. I have an agenda because people are always very interested in knowing what comes next. So first I will say a little bit about who I am, because I always forget to introduce myself. So that's why I have these kind of slides. Then I will discuss different types of algorithms, rule-based versus data-driven, the stages in the development of algorithms and the use of them. Say a little bit about humans versus algorithms, logic and explanation of algorithms, and then we move towards the topic that's also discussed in the tutorial. And at the end of the lecture, you can ask questions about, if you have questions about the tutorial of tomorrow morning. I will discuss regarding regulation of algorithms, why we should be interested in regulating algorithms and how we can regulate algorithms. So who am I? I'm a hero of the online world, I often say, and that's basically what I teach my students to become, heroes of the online world, that we can combine all the interesting legal backgrounds we learned during the rest of our teaching life. This goes automatically, that's nice. I can't talk too long about this. And if I will put you see the book Information Technology and Lawyers, I will put an introductory chapter for those people who are very interested in artificial intelligence law, an introductory chapter from that book, the gray book on Canvas. And that's the area where I worked in the 90s. And I was thinking yesterday about how cool we considered some use of, for instance, ape tails in names and things 20 years ago, and how how stupid it sounds if you think back. And one paper I did at that conference I referred to earlier from '99 in Oslo was a paper called AI and Law, Artificial Intelligence and Law. And then law was written with 3 W's to express the importance of the World Wide Web. And I thought it was a very cool name, and I was very glad I coined it. But even myself, I didn't use it after maybe 1 or 2 times because it was really a stupid name. This is just as a sort of nostalgic memory that traveling was still possible. Last year in San Francisco on an AI trip, visiting all kind of startups there. Was very nice. Holland in the Valley. And the reason I'm on this picture is because the chair of my university couldn't, and I replaced her. So that's why I don't really belong with ministers and princes and things, but it's nice to be on this picture. And this is another thing that is not really AI, but it's the sort of technology that still surprises me. This was the Amazon Go shop in San Francisco, where you walk into the shop after scanning your credit card and you just pick things from the store and walk out, and you don't have to. You pay automatically, but the interesting thing is that there's no RFID or other check of what you're taking, but it's all by cameras and sensors. So they just watch what you're doing, and then they know what you've taken out of the shop. So in this case, I took out this mug, and it was automatically deduced from the credit card of my colleague, who I paid back later. So now we move to the actual content, substance of this. The slides are a bit, so I use this new layout, and only now I see that the colors are for different faculties. So this is apparently the Faculty of Religion and Theology, because we as law normally have, I think, the green colors, but I wasn't aware of that it's in this slide, so just ignore it. Different. We will come across some other faculties for sure, because I like the colors. The slides were otherwise very annoying, but well, I won't bother you further with this. Different types of algorithms. This very striking cartoon, and maybe you have seen it before. I adapted it a bit. So here's this woman from a company asking the manager or one of the people higher in the company, where should we focus on this year? And he says, algorithms. It will change everything. Everybody's talking about it. And at the moment she starts asking, what exactly is algorithms? He doesn't have an answer. So then he says, also blockchain. And this is basically also one of the reasons why regulation is important. People are using technology because others are using technology. That's what regularly happens. Both, I must admit, that it's not only companies, but also governments. So governments are using technology, are using algorithms without knowing exactly what they're aiming at. And that can be very dangerous. So that's why in the paper that's also on Canvas, I consider the why question so important, that you always, if you want to introduce technology, if you want to introduce algorithms, you have to think first, why do I want to use it? And currently in the EU and in the Netherlands, there's this fuss about the apps that could help in remedying the COVID spread. And in and by itself, technology could be used for that, also in a very, very good way. But what's of course necessary is that you seriously think about how you gonna realize it, and not just as a sort of wild enthusiasm saying, yes, we should have an app, and then start developing without even having the requirements right in the first place. So it's so important, and that's what you see in particular when algorithms are used. And algorithms were the topic related to algorithms were referred to like 5 years ago, basically as big data. And the data is often the reason why companies or governments want to do something with technology, with data analytics, with algorithms. They have these data and they think we should do something with it. But it's so important that you think about what exactly you want with these data and not just start using algorithms and see where it ends, because then things can go seriously wrong because of this obscurity. I was referring to it at the second slide, obscured by algorithms, sort of obscurity, the black box nature of the algorithms, that things can go on in these algorithms that you can't have a firm grip on, and then it can be very detrimental to the people who are affected by the decisions of the algorithm. In particular, if the people who are using the algorithms don't even know what the algorithms are doing. And this is something that governments are facing, so that that there have been court cases in the Netherlands, for instance, that the government used an algorithm and they didn't understand the algorithm, they didn't know what the algorithm was doing, and then the judge annulled the decision by the government, not because the decision in and by itself was wrong in any way, but because the government wasn't capable of explaining what the algorithm did. And that's of course very important. If you use these algorithms, you should know what these algorithms are doing. And that's not only something that companies are, not only something that governments are running into, because companies, even very big companies, have the same. And you might have come across this this Apple case from late last year, and there's now an investigation going on in the US about the credit cards Apple was issuing, and then it appeared that the male people that applied for the credit cards got like 10 or 20 times more credit than their wives, even if all the variables were similar. Of course, one was different, namely male female, and that caused a reduction in credit of like 10 times. Even one of the big guys of Apple, Wozniak, was admitting that his wife got like 10 times less than he. And Apple, what Apple did, and that surprised me really, they adjusted it for this particular case where people were complaining. So they were complaining about the algorithm, saying, well, this is basically wrong. I get this credit and my wife get only like 10% of it. Then they changed it so it became equal for both male and female, but it didn't change the algorithm. They said, yeah, we can change the algorithm, but why can't you change the algorithm? You shouldn't be using it in the first place if it leads to these strange results. So it's now under investigation, but that's very surprising to me that companies so as big as Apple are apparently using algorithms that lead to outcomes that they can't justify themselves. When talking about algorithms, I don't have the definition here. So if you have lectures about algorithms, they often start with referring to this guy from Arabia or whatever, which name is some sort linked to algorithms. But what's important to understand when you talk about algorithms, that algorithm in and by itself is a very neutral concept and refers to basically instructions that, given a certain input, lead to a certain output. That's basically what an algorithm is, and that's why people often give as an example a recipe, because if you have a recipe, you have some input, some ingredients, and after a certain process, it leads to a certain outcome, a nice cake or whatever. So the basic concept of algorithm is very broad. If we talk about algorithms these days, we often refer to so-called self-learning algorithms. I will come back to it shortly. What I have on this slide are more classic sort of algorithms. And I have two examples here. One is a decision tree. It's about people being fit. So if you can move along this decision tree if you want to know if a person is fit. So first you ask his age. Is he under? So I can do it for myself. For instance, is a person fit? Are you under 30? Yes. Eat a lot of pizza? No. So I'm fit. So now I know I'm fit because I followed the decision tree. In case you're older than 30, you have to exercise in the morning, apparently, to be called fit. This shows several things. It's really clear. it's really clear what answers you, what questions you have to answer to come to the conclusion fit. You can also explain it. So if I ask this system, why am I fit? Then they will say, well, you're aged under 30 and you do not eat a lot of pizzas. It also shows that it's very incomplete, of course. There are many other reasons why you can be either unfit or fit. So it shows the incompleteness. But what's from a more from a legal perspective interesting about these kind of algorithms is that they can explain themselves. They can explain their outcomes because they can just follow the path they have that lead to the outcome and use that as an explanation for the conclusion. And this explanation based on the input is very difficult, if not impossible. You can discuss about that in when the more modern algorithms based on neural networks that I will discuss shortly are being used. So that's a very important thing to to distinguish. If you talk about algorithms, that you have these sort of classic algorithms where it's very easy to explain the outcomes. One problem that's also apparent is that you have to think before about all the possible situations, because if you haven't covered them, then it can't give an answer. So that's a problem with the algorithms. An if-then rule is basically similar to decision tree, but in another way defined, and it's there has been research for into what lawyers can understand, and a decision tree is very clear for lawyers. They immediately see what's happening, and if-then rules. If you have a list of if-then rules, it's very difficult to get a clear picture of what's going on there. But you can basically, I only put 2 if-then rules here, but you can basically represent this decision tree in terms of if-then rules. So if you use these kind of algorithms are being used. So the example I gave about social support, the systems they're using are this kind of systems. So they think about it in advance, and it also shows why the people were tweaking, because they understood that this person under age of 30 that eat a lot of pizzas was also eating all kind of other, he looked very healthy and he was exercising, so they were thinking he was fit and he can get the benefit, for instance. So then you can tweak, you can give us an answer that he didn't eat a lot of pizzas, and then the conclusion is the conclusion you want. But it's transparent, it's clear to you what's causing conclusion, so then you can tweak the outcomes, and you can explain what the reasoning comes down to. Then there's what you can call AI, and that's for this course interesting, because this course is about law and ethics of artificial intelligence. The decision tree and the if-then rules are very straightforward. It's very clear what's happening in terms of reasoning. In trying to have a sort of shell surrounding the reasoning of the system, they built in the 80s and 90s so-called expert or knowledge-based systems, and these basically had 3 parts. One was a rule base, so all these if-then rules are in there, an inference mechanism, that was the reasoning mechanism, and a user interface. And why this is different from what we saw on the previous slide is that if you have a rule base, all these if-then rules, and a separate inference mechanism, then you're not totally sure what outcomes are possible, in particular if you have a very big set of rules. Still, you can explain each outcome, because each outcome is the result of applying rules. So you can always reason back from the conclusion and say, well, we applied these rules, so that's the reason why we have this outcome. And that becomes different when you use the algorithms based on data that are the focus of discussion these days when we talk about algorithms. In a sort of historic overview, I was already referring to the 80s and the 90s. So legal expert systems in the beginning were just rule-based systems that could easily explain themselves. Then in the 1990s, then some neural networks experiments were going on in the legal area, and neural networks basically they often compare to how our brains are working, because you have in your brain you have synapses and neurons connecting, etc. And that's basically how a neural network also works. You have input, so for instance exercise, fitness, these are the input nodes, and you have the output node, fit or not fit. That's the output node in the neural network. And what the neural network then does is then based on all kind of input, and if you have like 2 or 4 input nodes, it's not very interesting. So normally you have like 20 or 100 different inputs, and based on this input, a certain output is provided by the system, for instance, fit or not fit. And this is not about reasoning. So if you have those rules and these decision trees, you see the analogy with reasoning, how we reason, and you can explain your reasoning, you can justify the outcomes. That's very important in the legal field, of course, that you can justify your outcomes. You can't justify it when you're using neural networks. The only thing you can say, well, this was the input and this is the output, but why this neural network decided that, of course it's trained, but still you can't explain what's going. That's why it's called a black box. You can't explain what's going on within the neural network going from the input to the output. And then in the so there were some experiments already in the 1990s. Then in the 2000s there was a shift in artificial intelligence from the rule-based or the expert system kind of technology to data-driven systems, and the real big progress came from 2013 onwards, when deep learning algorithms were being developed. And deep learning algorithms are basically layered neural networks. So you have this neural network, and then you have some other neural networks also. Then it becomes much more complicated, and these deep learning algorithms can do fascinating things. One thing that I find very impressive is that if you have an algorithm just watching a game and you don't instruct the algorithm in any way, it can learn the game and play the game. And that's if you think about rules and you want to teach even a simple game as Pong or Pac-Man or whatever, then you have to define many rules of the if-then kind or the decision tree, if at all possible. So that's very difficult, and that's the power of these deep learning algorithms, that based on input they can adjust themselves and learn themselves. But what they can do, explain. They can't explain what they're doing. And if you're playing a game, it doesn't matter you win or you lose. So then what does it matter that it can explain what it's doing? Like with chess or Go, the major breakthroughs the last 20 years in terms of beating humans in games. But if you use these same kind of systems in government, for instance, to decide whether you are a risk for fraud, then it might become, or then it becomes a problem if you can explain why this person is considered possible fraudulous and that person isn't considered possible fraudulous. So the explanation is in law very important, and is often not, it's not possible to provide it based on these deep learning algorithms. So they can do fascinating things, but they can't explain what they're doing. They just process input which lead to a certain output, but that's all the explanation they can give. They can say, well, I got this input and this leads me to this output, but they aren't capable of connecting the input to the output. What we do if we reason, we connect the facts of the case to a conclusion by applying rules, for instance, and then it becomes clear why we take a particular decision. And that's in case of when these algorithms are used, these deep learning algorithms, it's basically impossible. Two reasons why there are two circumstances why there has been such a major progress in deep learning algorithms: the huge availability of data, so the big data I was referring to before, and the ever increasing computing power. To rephrase what I was just saying, both algorithms, and then I mean the self-learning algorithms based on neural networks and the deep learning algorithms, and reasoning use input and output data. But, and that's very, very important to realize, if there's one thing you should learn from this class, it's the difference between deep learning algorithms that's commonly referred to if people use the term algorithms these days. These algorithms are not about reasoning. They are not about reasoning. They just correlate input data to output data. That's all they do. And that's why it's so difficult to let them explain their outcome. Even if it's very interesting or seems very interesting what they're doing, they can't explain how they came to these outcomes. Reasoning, on the other hand, what we as lawyers do, reasoning connects input data to output data, to phrase it in the same terms, based on arguments. Arguments are important. So arguments connect premises, the input data, to the conclusions, the output data. And you saw from the if-then rules and the decision trees, you can easily explain what's going on there, and you cannot explain it if the deep learning algorithms are used that are so popular these days. This is an example to show the dangers connected to just relying on the outcome of deep learning algorithms. Or correlation, it correlates input to output, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the correlation makes any sense. My battery is running low. One moment, sorry. Oh, getting some power to the, giving some power to the computer. Oh, yep. So saved. This is a very important. It's a very nice website that you can go to, and you can see various correlations that has nothing to do with anything. So this is an example where you see a very clear correlation between cheese consumption and people who died by tangled in their bedsheet. So if you have this algorithm and you feed him with all kind of data, here in this case with cheese consumption and number of people who died by tangled in the bedsheet, if you feed him with all this input, then the output becomes quite similar and connected. So if you have to make a government decision or a business decision, you think, there's something going on there. We should reduce the cheese consumption. People, new governmental decision. We should eat less cheese because that saves a lot of debt. Nonsense, of course. Nonsense. But because the algorithm can't explain itself, you might come to that conclusion. If you use your brains, of course, you won't. But if you just rely on the algorithm, you might come to the conclusion that if people would eat less cheese, that there will be less people dying from being tangled in their bed sheets. So this shows immediately the danger of algorithms not being able to explain themselves. You should be critical. If there's an outcome of an algorithm, you should always critically assess the outcomes, not take it for granted. And here you can clearly see that it's nonsense, but often that isn't the case. Often it's very subtle in a way. And that's why it's so important that people understand what they're looking at and what the algorithm is doing in order to be able to critically assess what is happening. And there are not that many people that really understand what's going on in these algorithms. So that's why it's important that technical people and data analytical people are consulted when these algorithms are being used. And this is also a reason why regulation of algorithms is an interesting topic, because if you would allow companies to rely on these kind of correlations, or governments, you start to become living in a society that you probably don't want to live in. So providing some constraints here might help for both governments and businesses. One additional problem of businesses is that they want to make money. That's why they are a business, of course. And if an algorithm works for them, they might think, well, we get more money if we apply it that way. We don't care if it's fully correct or not. And then you might get situations in society that you don't really want. And there are very many interesting examples in this context that can be given. I'm not sure whether you have been or are familiar with the book by Cathy O'Neill on weapons of mass destruction. She gives many very insightful examples, and the one I like most is about insurances of people driving in cars. They base it in the US on the credit card score, and it works for the companies. They make the most money that they can make by relying on credit card scores, by determining how many people should pay for their insurance, their car insurance. But what the consequence of applying these kind of algorithms is that the people who don't have that much money are more often failing by paying their credit card loans or whatever than people who have lots of money. So you get a sort of discrimination of the poor people. So the poor people pay more for their car insurance, and it has nothing to do with driving safe. It's just a proxy, something that's related, that makes it possible for the company to ask people more money for their insurance. And one problem with these algorithms in the case of insurance of cars is that all companies are using them. So it doesn't make sense to go to another company because they use the same. So the consequence then is that basically poor people pay more for their car insurance indifferent of how safe they're driving, and rich people pay less indifferent of how unsafe they are driving. And there you can ask yourself, okay, company makes money, but do we want as a society these kind of use of algorithms? Do we want as a society this kind of behavior of companies? I don't want it, and that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in regulation of algorithms, to prevent these kind of strange outcomes. And the most extreme example in this context is a rich person that was convicted of drunken driving that pays less than a poor person who drives very safely. That to me is very absurd, and regulation should do something about it. This is from another online presentation, a Skype presentation, and this also shows that we often don't understand what the algorithm is doing. So I gave the example of the correlation between. Hey, wait. Are there chats here? Anyone interested in how data numbers can be abused? Read. Ah, that's just nice. Thank you. Thank you for the suggestion. Oh, I got lost again. Oh. Can people still see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, because I don't. There's something very strange going on in Zoom today. I have no idea. What is going on here? Well, I'm still talking, I can see. So where were we? Yeah, so about the understanding of the algorithm, a nice example from personal experience. I recorded this lecture via Skype and edited a bit, and then uploaded it to YouTube. And YouTube suggests thumbnails to be put on your YouTube channel. Thumbnails are just parts of the video that you can use to represent your video. And before YouTube suggested the thumbnails, I was thinking, well, I hope that this Ministry of Truth part is one of the thumbnails. And then YouTube suggested 3 thumbnails, those 3. And I was thinking, wow, what a smart algorithm, that YouTube knows what I want. It's so incredible. And I was even more surprised because I was starting to doubt whether I maybe even want to use that other thumbnail that also looked nice with the beach and the picture of Stockholm. So that's how I understood the algorithm, that it was smart and was understanding me. But what basically was happening is that it selected thumbnails from the video that were different from all other thumbnails that could have been selected, because the third you see is how most parts of the video were just my talking head and this slide. So these were very different. So it had nothing to do, which I thought was the justification or the explanation of selecting those, knowing me or knowing what's interesting from the video, but just some technical process. And that's something you have to be very careful with if algorithms are used, that you sometimes think you understand why they came to a particular conclusion, but there can be a very different reason why the algorithm decided the way it decided. And in particular, if you decide upon the rights of people, you have to be very careful, of course, in not understanding when you not understand the algorithm. And in my view, you shouldn't use algorithms if you don't understand them. In particular, not if you decide on people. So, some other inherent flaws to. Do you still see my slides?
Yes, without no problem.
So
Yes,
okay,
of course.
there's some inherent. So we already touched upon several of them. Some inherent flaws of using data analytics, using the self-learning algorithms. One question you can ask yourself: how good is the past to predict the future? Because whatever you're doing, so if you make rules, so the if-then rules or the decision trees, you might think about particular future scenarios that might occur and try to cover them. If you use data analytics, you can't, because you always use data from the past. So you always use data from the past to do something in the future. And that's something you can think about when using this kind of technology, whether that's always making sense to use these data from the past. And sometimes it leads to very, you probably all are familiar with the example of Amazon, where they use the data from the past to select people, and then women didn't have a chance because apparently the people working at Amazon were mainly male. So that based on the algorithm, that appeared to be good people, and female were not that good people based on the algorithm. But that's also a very good example, to me at least, that if you would ask the why question, why are you using this algorithm? And if you use a bit of critical thinking, you can understand that if you use this data from the past, that it won't change anything in the future. So you can change the people working with your company. But this is a flaw of data analytics. It's based on data from the past. So it's very critical when you're selecting your data. And related to that is a black swan. So the very inventive things, because you're based on you base your decisions on data from the past, necessarily from the past. Very innovative ideas won't occur, so-called black swans. And a nice quote in this context is from Ford, that was saying, if I would ask my customers what they want, they would ask for faster horses and not for cars. So if we had been using self-learning algorithms and data analytics 100 years ago, we would still be riding horses and not driving in cars. One other problem related to using those analysis of data is that a lot of data are being used and then there are profiles being created, but who isn't unique? So you also always have your own variables, your own context that makes you different from a particular profile maybe, but you are based on the data analysis you put in a particular profile. It's often that's the if the computer says no, it's often difficult to explain to the people using the algorithm that you are different from whatever they think you belong to. So who's not unique is a very important question to ask when using algorithms and trying to generalize things in terms of your analysis. Then proxies already refer to it, that you don't use the direct, so you don't use information about how people are driving, but you use a proxy, something that seems to be related or can help in making your decisions to decide upon whatever you have to decide upon. So proxies can be very dangerous because they are only indirect. They're not directly explaining whatever decisions you're making. Then I think this is a nice moment to have a short break, and I can also try to fix my my Zoom environment. So I will suggest that at 12 or let's say 12:01. So 10 minutes, 12:01, we resume with our lecture. And I will stop the recording. Totally lost here. Oh my God. What's going on? I hope I only see my slides now. I hope people can see me and the slide. Can someone? I can only hear people. So if someone can.
We can see you. No problem.
And you see also the slides.
Yes.
Okay. So if you want to interrupt, please just start talking, because that's the only thing. I don't see anyone now. So I'm very lonely, yeah, behind my computer, only seeing my slides. I don't even see myself. But if it works, it works. So I will continue then. So when you think about these algorithms and when you think about regulating those algorithms, one thing you have to take into account is the different stages involved in algorithms, both in terms of thinking about how to use these algorithms, and in terms of if you want to regulate these algorithms, what you should focus on. This is in a sort of elaborate way what's happening when you work on these algorithms. It starts with gathering data, and that's a first point where things can go wrong in practice. So you have to be careful to select the right data. You have to think about what data could be relevant for whatever decision you're wanting to make. So when you gather the data, you have to be very critical. Also in terms of accuracy of data. So if you decided the right categories of data, within those categories you have to have accurate data to represent the decisions you wanna make with the algorithm. So that's an important point, and that's also some point where regulation can focus on in terms of discrimination, for instance, that people people explain how they gather the data and what decisions were underlying their selection processes. So that's an important phase in the stages of algorithms for both practically and in terms of regulation. Then you prepare the data, so you make them fit for your whatever technology you're using. You choose a particular model that can be used to analyze the data. Then you train the data. Sometimes they train themselves. So you have, if you have the self-learning algorithms, then you don't have to train them. Training means that you provide them feedback on whatever output they're providing. So to return to the fitness example, if based on a particular input, the output of the neural network is fit, and you know that it should be unfit, you can correct it, and then it will adjust the balances within the so-called black box of the neural network. So that's what training refers to, that you can give feedback on the outcomes. But what in terms of regulation and also in practice is probably the most interesting, those networks that train themselves. So you just provide them with input and they get a particular output. But then as we saw with the example of the cheese consumption and the death rate of people being strangled in their bed sheets, you have to be very careful whatever connections this network is making in between input and output. You have to evaluate and tune the parameters, so whatever input, and finally you can use them for predicting, for deciding in our context, for make a decision for a particular citizen or a particular consumer. In a more in a shorter version, the stages are basically design. So you design the algorithm, then you are using it. In general, you look at how it's working, and then finally you use it specifically to decide upon. And use in general and use specifically, we will see later in the context of explanation and regulation, refers to the more systematic accountability in general, and use specifically to the justification in the individual cases. But we will return to that. Then a topic that is a very broad topic and a very important topic to understand the differences between humans and algorithms. It can be sometimes is misused as an excuse that humans didn't do it very well in the first place, and then they're using algorithms no matter what mistakes the algorithms are making or whatever. In particular with discrimination, they often use these examples that people were also discriminating, and it might be so. It depends on the particular situation. But it's important to understand what makes people different from algorithms. I have some examples to make it more clear, and also one from the law where they make this distinction. This is the first example. There are two posters for announcing a lecture that was obviously, as you can see on the second poster, by me. And if people were discussing which poster to use, so in the actual case they used the poster without my picture, and someone made the poster with the picture, and I thought it was a bit overkill to have me so big on a poster. But you can discuss this as humans, and you can say, well, I like the red of this poster, or you can say, well, this guy looks like an interesting one to talk about this topic, so it can attract people. You can discuss about it as humans in that way, which poster you would prefer. And I said in the end, I didn't prefer the one with my picture on it because I thought it was sort of overkill. If you would have an algorithm analyze, So based on the input of these posters and say like hundreds of other posters from previous occasions and correlated with the show up, how many the turn up, how many people visited the actual lecture, it might turn out that the picture with the poster with the face is selected as the best one to get as many people as possible. But you don't know, that's the problem in terms of explanations, you don't know why. You can think of a possible justification. So if the algorithm decides, well, you should use the poster with the head, then you can justify it as, yeah, probably because there's a head and it's something that attracts people, or you can make all kind of you can have all kinds of these, but it could be, for instance, that the reason they select the algorithm selected the poster with the picture is because there was some white background, and in the past it appeared that white background on posters attracts a lot of people. So then this makes clear that you not always understand why an algorithm decides the way it decides. And in the terms of the posters, it doesn't matter that much if you use the one or the other poster. But if you decide upon people, it of course matters based on what reasons a particular decision is being made. So you have to know why the algorithm chose a particular, in this context, poster. If on this decision depends people being given an employment benefit, for instance, or not, or people being allowed to a certain school or not, then you should know more about it than just guessing maybe it's this or that. So that's a very important thing, and the people in practice not necessarily are in particular businesses interested in that. If they use the algorithm, and in this context, for instance, it turns the outcome is that a lot of people show up whenever the algorithm is being used to select a poster, they're fine with it. But they reason in the same context in terms of giving people loans and things, and or if a government decides upon whether you're a risk to fraud, etc. But in these cases, it's important that you understand why, based on what parameters, because all kind of underlying things that you don't get a grip on can cause the decision. And in my opinion, if you decide things, you have to know more than just based on this input, we got this output, what's happening, what's going on. And if people, either governments or businesses, can take the responsibility, in my opinion, regulations should define the constraints under which these algorithms are being used. This is another interesting distinction to show the difference between people and algorithms. One is about that if algorithms are stupid, then people might even follow them. So here, the algorithm suggests to congratulate Guillermo Samadi, an Argentinian AI professor, who has a job for over 25 years. The algorithm suggests to congratulate him with his new job, and you can see that at least 5 people are congratulating. So you're just blindly following the algorithm. So you can question how well people are equipped to critically assess outcomes of algorithms. If a computer suggests something, they often take it over quite blindly without being critical. And in terms of algorithms that you're not fully aware of what's going on there in between the input and the output, it's very important to stay critical. But it's difficult for people to stay critical, even in case of these simple examples where basically everyone should know that that it doesn't make sense to congratulate someone with a new job he already has for like 25 years. And then other from the other side to make a distinction between humans and algorithms. This is an algorithm you can download from Google, software that you can use to train on databases. It's nice if you want to have some practical experiments. And here the algorithm was used to train the recognition of sneakers. And if you feed them with the above picture, it will say like 98% sure that it's a sneaker. If you feed them with the below picture, with the sneaker turned upside down, he has no clue. He has no idea what's fed into his system. And this, for humans, it's immediately clear that the second picture also is sneaker. For algorithm that's being trained with sneakers, it isn't clear. And why? Because it's trained with sneakers always with the sole down. So if it's turned upside down, it doesn't understand it. And of course you can, because here you recognize the mistake, you can adjust it. You can learn the algorithm that he should turn whatever is being fed into him and see if it's turned, it matches whatever is in its system. You can learn him that, but that's because here it's obvious. Not always it's obvious why the sneaker below wasn't being recognized as a sneaker. And if you imagine that someone didn't get a particular funding or whatever because the case wasn't correctly recognized and you don't know it, then you have a problem, because you cannot justify it also to the person in question. So this is to illustrate that you should be very critical about what your algorithm is doing. And if you don't understand it, so here you can see what's going wrong. If you don't really understand how it's working, then in particular in areas where decisions impact on people, don't use them. Just don't use them. So like in the case of Apple, if you don't understand why women are getting like 10 times less credit than male, don't use it. Use it only if you understand what it's doing. So that's, and because in this case, Apple can take the responsibility, you might need regulation that forces companies to take this responsibility. This is from the law, because this course about law and ethics of artificial intelligence. And the things I was discussing, so I gave several examples where I don't like the use of algorithms in terms of insurance and things. It might be that what's going on there from a legal perspective is okay. But so then my arguments are more ethical, you could say. But things you can think about as a lawyer, if these things you desire that you consider better for society shouldn't be included in the law. And one interesting example in this context is from that explains it also is from the banking industry. That's legally a decision that's acceptable or allowed, but ethically you can have questions. And if you have ethical questions, you should think about whether you don't want to have something in the law that prevents people from doing what they're doing. And the example from the bank industry is that the bank in deciding whether a company should go bankrupt or not, because they are one of the people who can ask for money, and they, by asking money, they can cause the company to go bankrupt. In making the decision, the banks used as a parameter the people in the company that had a loan with their bank. That has nothing to do with whether the company should or should not go bankrupt. It has nothing to do with it. It's only self-interest. And maybe legally it is allowed, but you can question whether you want as a society these decisions being made. And in particular now, if you do it yourself, you can still tweak it. So this is an example from actual practice, and the person using these kind of inputs decided based on some classes I give to no longer do it in the future. But if you would have it in an algorithm, you maybe even don't know why the algorithm decides to select this company as going bankrupt and that company as not going bankrupt. So you have to be able to explain what information is being used to make the decisions. And these decisions shouldn't discriminate or shouldn't use the wrong information to base their decisions upon. What's in the GDPR, I'm sure you're all familiar with the General Data Protection Regulation, is that you as a data subject, so you as a citizen or a consumer, or that you have a right to not be subject to decision based solely on automated processing. So if there's this algorithm used by either a governmental organization or a company, you have the right to not have a decision being made on you that has legal effect for you or affects you significantly, solely based on automated processing. And based solely, if you recall the example of LinkedIn, where people were congratulating based on a suggestion by the algorithm, then this congratulation isn't based solely on automated processing because the person was deciding. And I think that in terms of reviewing decisions, people are very weak. Where they're good in is the a sort of appeal function. So if you have these automated decisions, then you complain with the people. Not all people are capable of doing that. Some people will just rely on the system, say, well, the system decided like that. But if you have good arguments, then people are capable of taking them into account, and an algorithm can't. So I think that the human, this is so-called human in the loop. The human in the loop makes sense in sort of appeal phase, but I wouldn't rely too much on the human in the phase of critically assessing the outcome the algorithm presents. And that is why I think it's important to let companies and governments account for the algorithms they're doing and be sure that even if there's this decision based where humans are involved, the decision is sound and can be explained, because having this human involved doesn't give it much extra warranties, extra guarantees. So I think this is a sort of misunderstanding of what humans can do in terms of protecting the citizens and the consumers. So important, the appeal function, so that you can complain about these decisions with the humans, so that you can provide your arguments. And it's important that the company or the government explains clearly what kind of decisions, all these stages we also discussed, have been made to select the data, to choose the model, to evaluate, that they can explain that, they can account for that. That's a nice bridge to the logic and explanation. As you can see, the bottom, we're now in the School of Business and Economics. This is also from the from the GDPR, and what's important here to understand is that with logic isn't meant the what's normally meant with logic. So, or at least to me, logic means having premises and conclusions and deducing the conclusion based on the premises. That's what I would call logic, and that is not what algorithms are doing, that we discussed at the beginning of this lecture. So you have input that correlates to output. Logic is what rules are doing, so they're explaining why the particular input, the premises, lead to the conclusion. The logic that's referred to in this recital is a different logic. It's not the logic that is normally referred to when talking about logic. They mean here with logic a sort of making clear what's going on. So the logic involved, you shouldn't confuse with what is normally understood by logic. And it also reoccurs in Article 13 and 14 and 15. It's very interesting to look, if you haven't done so before, to look into Article 13, 14 and 15 of the GDPR, because they're almost identical, but they are for different situations. 13 is for data being provided by the data subject, 14 for data being collected without being provided by the data subject, but it's in terms of legal drafting not very very nice, but so that's why you can find identical phrasings in Article 13, 14 and 15. But here again there's reference to the logic involved. Understand that it's not the logic from premises to conclusions, but the logic in terms of that it makes sense what's going on there. So it's not logic in a formal way. Then this is the different types of explanation, and that I already anticipated on it before. There are two ways of explanation, and some people argue that in the GDPR there's no requirement to explain a decision in the individual case. That's only required to explain how the system works. So that's these are two different things. So at the one end, you can explain in a general way what the algorithms are doing. So what data you're using, what model, how you trained it, how you ascertain that the outcomes are being checked and being evaluated, and that you don't have decisions that you can't explain or can justify. So that's on a more general level, and that's before a decision is being made, and that's something that accountability also refers to, so that you can account for whatever the system is doing. Then in law, it's of course very important that you can justify decisions. So if a particular decision is being made, that you can justify the outcome, provide the rationale, the reasons. And the problem with use of algorithm often is that you can't explain the particular decision. Sometimes you can, but often you can't explain why the decision was either good for the person or bad for the person. And from an example I regularly also give in this context is the use of, for instance, social media profiles. So if you have this this insurance company that use information from social media profiles, it might be that two tenured law professors ask for a loan, and that one is getting the loan and the other isn't, and that the reason for it is that the one has on his Facebook some references to classical music, and the other has some references to hip-hop music, and that might change the decision from giving the loan to not giving the loan. And I think that's also refers to the uniqueness of the people. So in general, the data processing of the insurance company, the loaning companies apparently came to the conclusion that if people like hip hop, they are normally paying less money back or not as well paying money back as people who like classical music. I'm not sure whether to me it doesn't make sense on a general level as well, but as far as it does in an individual case, it shouldn't make a difference, of course. And it's also, it discriminates people based on things that you shouldn't use to make these kind of decisions. But this one, it can be used on purpose and knowingly, that the companies are knowing that they make decisions. But if you train the algorithms and you don't have control over it, it might even be that these decisions are being made without you knowing it. So that then decisions are being made that you don't even want as a company. And that's something that should become apparent if you talk about the system functionality, if you explain what's going on there in your algorithm and can make clear how the decisions were being made. And that system level and individual cases refer to the accountability and the justification, as I was already explaining in the previous slide. And both accountability at a system level and justification should be part of regulation. And this brings us to the last part of our presentation, that's regulation. Regulation why and regulation how. First, regulation of algorithms. Why? I think by now, we're now in the Faculty of Behavioral and Movement Sciences, so we're becoming very sporty. In a normal class, I would have some discussion now, but I can't even see anyone, so that doesn't make much sense. So just talking to my slides. Because we came across many reasons already why algorithms should be regulated. One of the reasons is, if you think about advertisements, this is a quote about advertisement, and says that some of the best, or at least sharpest minds on the planet are devoted to guessing what we might buy next and showing us advertisement for it. Often the results are ludicrously inaccurate, sometimes they're creepily precise. So you can get sometimes a suggestion based on emails you're sending to people. For instance, you can get advertisements that are very precise and have some creepiness in it, that you get suggestions for listening to particular music, of seeing movies based on what you were discussing in your email. But it can also be very inaccurate, and the most common example, I'm sure you're all familiar with it, that you just booked a ticket to a particular place, or you bought shoes, and that weeks after you still get this same advertisement. But if you take this into account, that people who really want to make money and are really smart make these kind of algorithms, would you trust this kind of technology to predict what crimes we might next commit, or let it decide our legal rights? It's something you have to think about when you discuss the issue of regulating those algorithms. And I think if you take into account what this quote is referring to, that we shouldn't rely too much on the algorithms, or at least people should be able to account for what they're doing and how they're doing it. That's very important. This is a quote I always use in these kind of presentations, and that's something maybe this is you should take home with you and think about it more, because it's a very important point. We are relying on algorithms in government, in business. More and more decisions are made on behalf of us, sometimes very clearly, sometimes we are nudged without even being realized that we are being nudged. But we have to critically think about how far we will let the algorithms decide our lives, because we are building a society that we if it's being built further and further at one moment are not maybe very happy with. So this is still a good moment. It was in 2014, but I think it's still a good moment to think about these kind of issues. This is if there are some Dutch students in this class, they will know this example because it was my quiz question before the first lecture of the basic course in the master, the Dutch master. This is the results when you Google search for law professor. Maybe I did this presentation in Lisbon, and someone pointed out that on the second row, the second person is Barack Obama, which none of my students, neither I, were aware of. But why I use this example is that if you search for law professor, the only results you get is male people. That's an algorithm. Google used an algorithm. Do we want such an algorithm? And it is still being used. If you search for law professor, you get the results. Do we want to allow this kind of results? You can think about it critically. Is this something you want to have regulation on, that it should be more better reflecting actual practice? Because there are, of course, lots of female and very good female law professors, but none of them is shown in the first 15 results. The one in the middle on the first row is a woman. But as you can see in the text underneath is, what should you call your law professor? That's a woman addressing a law professor. So they're only male here. These are things you can think about. So this is use of an algorithm. And this is another example you probably are familiar with. If you search for baby, you get this as a result. And it's very wide, isn't it? So this is decided by Google as a representation of what a baby looks like. And I think if you think back about the stages in the algorithm, that there are some mistakes made here in terms of what should be the result of someone looking for pictures of a baby. There should be more variety than just giving this as a result. So in terms of regulation, and that also lines in with the quote from Richardson King: do we want to live in a society where if you look for for law professor, you only get males, or when you look for babies, you only get white people? I personally, I don't like it. And if companies can take the responsibility themselves, we might have to force them to change these kind of policies. And I don't give the example in this class, but some people will be familiar with the search for the auto complete function. So if you search for women are, it isn't auto completed. If you search for Jews are, it isn't auto completed, because the things that came out were rubbish. It was the algorithm doing it. So you can use as an explanation, it's the algorithm, it's not me, but you should be accountable for what your algorithm is doing. So if you look for Mexicans or Americans are, you don't get a result. If you look for Dutch are, you get a result, which is quite frustrating for us as Dutch people, because it says that we are cold and unfriendly and not friendly, and we're such nice people. But that's what Google, what the algorithm is telling about us as Dutch people. Yeah, biases. These are biases about the Dutch, that we are not friendly. And biases is one of the main issues people are talking about when discussing regulation of algorithms. And you can prevent the biases, for instance, when you select the data. When you select the data, you can select them in the right way, or when you train it, or when you evaluate it, you can try to prevent biases getting into the system. These are some quotes from this year, mainly. So three kind of biases found in AI datasets, why algorithms can be racist and sexist. It's a very important issue. So to prevent bias when algorithms are being used, and companies and governments know this and try to work on it, but it might be that they are not good enough in doing it, and that we have to either, based on existing discrimination law, have some legal actions concerned with it, or maybe have some law specific for algorithms to prevent biases getting into those systems. Algorithms, yeah. Well, it's just you can read it at home, the quote, and the last is an optimistic note. Biased algorithms are easy to fix than biased people. That's an interesting one. So people often, even without being aware themselves, can be very biased in the things they are doing and are acting upon. And it's very difficult to change people. But algorithms, if you are careful in selecting your data, if you are careful in what model you're using, and if you're careful in evaluating the system and monitoring the outcomes that come out of the system and adjust where necessary, then you can fix the bias. And I think it's true that in the end, it's easier to fix a machine because machines are in the end just doing what we tell them to do. So if we tell them and if we learn them not to be biased, they won't be biased. People, even if we tell them they still not to be biased, they still can act biased. So I think that's an optimistic note on biases. Nice to close this collection of quotes. Then some general threats of algorithms apart from biases that are a reason why we should be interested in regulating those algorithms. Inadequate profiling, and that's what you often see in advertisements. I have this example from an advertisement I got last year when I was in San Francisco, where you saw the picture from earlier in this presentation. Got this advertisement for the Steinway suit offered fully furnished at $3.7 million. And the reason was that I visited this apartment and was looking for it on Google. So I got for like 2 or 3 weeks advertisements of this apartment. And this is of course not something that I would be interested in. I can easily afford 3.7 million. That's not a problem, but why would I want to have an apartment in San Francisco? So inadequate profiling can be a problem with algorithms. Misinformation, decision based on profiles without understanding why. Facial recognition, so there's a lot of automated processing taking place with facial recognition. Mass surveillance, both by governments and businesses. And a very sad example is from how the Uyghurs are being monitored in China with the help of algorithms. So these are some reasons why algorithms should be regulated. And to finish off this this presentation, remaining in the sporty mode of the Faculty of Behavioral and Movement Sciences, how should we regulate algorithms? These are some documents, interesting documents from the UK, from the US. There's much more. There's a nice list Tina put on Canvas. An interesting concept I want to share with you is what they call ethics whitewashing. So you see more and more companies like Google and Facebook. Facebook was now also trying to prevent people. That's so hypocrite to me, but because of Corona, people are more and more on social media, and they want to prevent the sort of addiction to Facebook. So they building some features. So first they developed this system, this Facebook, to have people hooked on it by all kind of new things in the timeline, etc. So their really incentive was to make people addicted to the platform, and now they're sort of trying to behave as good company and say, well, we're working on that people aren't too much on their social media during the COVID, and also doing other things like staring out the window and whatever. But what is used as a term is ethic whitewashing. So that's saying, well, they talk about ethics, Google, Facebook, and all these big companies, that we want to act ethically when using algorithms, when using artificial intelligence, but that they're not really interested in it. Even if they're not really interested in it, I think it's good that it's at least on the agenda, that they do address it. So ethics whitewashing might be a bit cynical, but I think it's good that at least there's attention to ethics also by these companies. Well, I discussed already the accountability, and you see some in the US, for instance, there's a lot of focus. There have been several algorithmic accountability acts, both on a federal level. I think it's still just a proposal, but on a state and city level, there has been already adapted algorithmic accountability act. So that was what we have been discussing during this class, that people should account for what they're doing. And it's interesting, if you want to know about what kind of things you should think about in terms of accountability, to look into those acts of the US. The primarily why question we have been addressing, and if you are using it, how you're going to use it, what data, what model training, etc. So that's what you should take into account when you discuss accountability, when you account for what you are doing as a government or a company. Because this is an interesting document when you're interested in the in artificial intelligence and the use of it in an lawful and ethical way. These are ethical guidelines from the EU. It's also on Canvas. Yeah, these guidelines do not intend to substitute any form of current or future policy making or regulation, nor do they aim to deter the introduction thereof. So they sort of keeping it open that regulation is being introduced on the issues we have been discussing during this class. And then, to me, most interesting is a piece from the European Parliament from April last year, a government's framework for algorithmic accountability, the 4 policy options, the regular. Now, I'm not going into that for time reason, but please look into this document. It's a very, very interesting document by the European Parliament, and also use it for this. I think when you discuss algorithms, you should categorize them, because not all algorithms should be regulated, but categorize them in certain levels of harm. So you have harmless algorithms that don't impact on people, then there's no need to regulate them. A calculator, for instance, has an algorithm, but it doesn't make sense to regulate the algorithm used in the calculator. Then a sort of intermediate harm. Then the accountability and the explainability we have been discussing should be enough. So what they're doing in the US now is the algorithmic accountability acts should be enough to introduce into the regulation. If there's severe harm, if people are really being influenced by whatever decisions being made, or if the area, medical or whatever it's being used, you believe it shouldn't be used in, it should be prohibited, or prohibited except if there's a license or a permission. So I think you can sort of categorize the use of algorithms in these 3 categories: the harmless, the intermediate harm, and the severe harm, with the consequences that we just discussed. How can you determine the levels? So if it's harmless or intermediate harm, etc., how can you determine? Then this piece from the European Parliament can be helpful. You can look, for instance, at the impact of the output of the algorithm. Does it have human rights implications? The scale of use, the reversibility or not of the consequences, in what domain it's being used, the verifiability of its behavior, the explainability. So there's many issues we already discussed, but it's good to think of when you categorize the algorithms of those that should be regulated, those that not necessarily have to be, or that not have to be regulated, and algorithms that should be prohibited. And then one last word, there should be a statutory requirement for both government and business to account. So what they're doing in the US with the accountability, algorithmic accountability acts for the use. And if you have this, you should also have a sort of supervisory body that can check these. And this is was my last slide, except for this wonderful last slide that I am always using since someone learned me that you should finish with your picture and your name and who you are and how you can be reached. So you can reach me. And now I'm open for questions about the assignment if there are any. But you should speak up because otherwise I only see my slide as said. So if someone has a question about the assignment, please talk to me. I can't read I'm not sure what is going on, but I can't read the chat either. So if there are any questions, or are there still people there?
Yes.
Ah, okay. Yeah, I can see. Are there any questions about or other questions?
Arno, can you upload the slides?
Yes, I will.
As well?
Yes,
okay,
I will.
Thanks.
Other questions?
Well, maybe a bit, but not really a question, but I heard, and for me myself as well, that we had some trouble with coming up with examples for 1B, and not the question like, can you give us an example? But at least for me, I kept going into, I don't know how you would call it in English, but like a cirkelredenering. That I couldn't really notice the difference between the two anymore. So maybe if you could elaborate on